Welcome to Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate.
Channel and the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Scholarship Interview Series. I'm so excited to be talking to you all, and mostly I'm so excited to be talking with Marlene this morning. Marlene, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, yes.
Great. Can you start by just giving us a quick introduction to who you are and where you're talking to us from?
Yes, I'm a first-year Ancient Cultures PhD student. I'm studying at Stellenbosch University, close to Cape Town here in South Africa. I speak Moki, so I still live in Pretoria, luckily.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for taking the time to chat with us. Let's dive into what your research interests are. Can you give us a brief explanation of what you're looking into in your research?
Yes, I specialize in Egyptian symbolism, so my thesis, I am focusing on the 𝀭Support motif. So the phrase 𝀭Support means the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. So for the people of Egypt, the idea of 𝀭Support stems from the way history of Egypt is made up of. So periods in Egypt are defined through the stability. So often Egypt was divided under two or more rulers, while other times they were again reunited under one pharaoh. So in these periods of unification, one sees especially the emergence of the 𝀭Support motif used on artifacts and tomb reliefs. So I will be conducting an iconographical study, basically a study on symbol, the 𝀭Support motif, to understand how its form and function changed across the span of Egypt history.
That sounds very cool, and that's a lot of history to take a look at. What are your plans for summer, and how will HAPS funding help you achieve them?
Your summer, so I'll mostly be working on my thesis here in Pretoria, but I will also be traveling to Stellenbosch University in some postgraduate seminars as part of my degree requirements. There are very few bursary opportunities available in Africa, so many of them usually for students in the science and engineering field. As a humanities student, I've not been able to acquire any necessary funding. So I work part-time at a pet shop to help support myself. Like I enjoy working with the animals. But if I am fortunate enough to receive financial support, it will help me to focus a lot more on my to work part-time. If I do have some money left over, I hope to use it for museum photographs. So I'll get in contact with museums for high quality image and table reliefs that I require from. So the grant will actually help pay for these photo commissions. I also hope to publish my database with these photographs in the end. I have already 200 items listed with the 𝀭Support motif, and so I hope to facilitate further research by publishing an exhaustive of these images.
That sounds incredibly interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the process of getting these museum photographs? I'm not sure if it's a process that everyone's familiar with, but it can be complex and costly and pretty difficult, I think, with copyright involved as well. Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, yeah. So the biggest problem I currently face is when you go onto a museum, most of the images are either small, insignificant pictures that you can't really see details on. So in an iconographical field, I need to know how many lines are there in a certain part of the image. So when I need proper images for this, one will usually contact the museum since they reach out to their representatives. And so most of the times they will require a down payment or a fee for them to take a proper image of the artifact or the relief in order for you to use it as your own image. So basically you buy the copyright of the image.
Turns out there's a lot of legal intricacies in carrying out PhD work, which isn't always obvious from the onset.
Yeah, I know.
We have some questions from the audience listening in.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how you became interested in the symbolism of the unification of Egypt? What kind of objects do you see this symbolism on?
You brought it, but I think that I became interested in the unification symbol.
Yes.
So I especially enjoyed focusing on mostly plants. So in my beginning of my research for my research proposal for my PhD, I started with the idea of working on the lotus. And gradually, as I was going through images, I started to see this specific symbol popping up a lot more. I was studying. And so when I went into trying to understand what the symbol means and interpret it, I found that there's quite a big gap in research on the Sematawi motif. It's not as exhaustive, it's not as in-depth as I would like. And so I later on found that the Sematawi motif is also present in other ancient Near East cultures, which is quite interesting because the symbol is made up of different hieroglyphs. So for a hieroglyph sentence to end up in cultures that don't necessarily use hieroglyphic writing is quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you seeing this motif on like large scale monumental architecture style art, or is it tend to be on more art that you can carry with you, something more portable?
It ranges very vastly. So I found it on little scarabs inscribed with a Sematawi motif, while you also get them on colossal statues, usually on the throne base. You'll see it on the sides. So the Khafre statue, the Amenhotep statues, all of them mostly have the Sematawi on the sides of this throne base. But you even get them on large walls in like the Luxor temple or even the Karnak temple. So they can go very large scale as well.
So this is a sort of wide-ranging symbolism. It's interesting that there hasn't been a lot of in-depth research on it before now. Do you find that other cultures use this motif differently?
I was very lucky to have
I'm
stumbled upon the. That's sort of the hypothesis of my thesis of how the symbol sort of changed from a simple sentence being read as the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt as a sign. So like not necessarily read STOP. So to a more widely accepted sign. Yeah, so it was found on the Darius the Great statue, especially. So
that's fascinating. How widespread do you find instances of this motif? How far outside of sort of the Nile Delta area are you seeing this image?
The furthest I have found was as far as the Euphrates. So places like Tanis and all the cities across the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So also in the Nimrud ivories. you will find certain characteristics, not necessarily the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but similar ideas and concepts of this symbol being used or used in their own artistics. I've narrowed down my research mostly to Egypt and Southwest Asia, so I've not necessarily expanded my reach a lot further.
I mean, there's a lot of temporal and geographical area to cover with this, so that's even still a fairly broad area to look at. So a lot of research is awaiting you. Can you talk a little bit? You mentioned that other cultures are using hieroglyphs that don't necessarily have hieroglyphic writing. So can you talk about how other cultures are using hieroglyphs if they don't have that as something internal to their writing systems? Does it appear different? Is it used differently in these other cultures?
I've not necessarily dived into such a topic, but as I'm aware, the language barrier was there, but they used similar words. So, like we do today, English borrows words from other cultures. But my experience with the Sawi word translated into.
You broke up a little bit at the end of that answer. Would you mind repeating that for us?
Yes, so I've not seen Sematawi motif phrase being used in other cultures with their own language vocabulary. So that's my experience. I've not necessarily focused on it in other sense.
A potential research question awaiting you for this summer. Can you talk about some of the seminars that you spoke about as an opportunity this summer? Are you going to have the chance to present on this research as part of the seminars, or is this seminars for you to sit in and gain additional understanding and grounding for your work?
The big reason I'm going is mostly to listen. So the what do you call it? The speakers have not been announced yet. So I have ideas of presenting, but it's not been specifically allocated yet.
So there's potential. That's exciting. It's always fun to get to share your work with different communities. I'm curious, speaking of sharing your work and here on YouTube as a platform, how do you find talking about subjects like this motif, which can be rooted in hieroglyphs and different cultures and different languages? Do you find it easy to convey this to different types of audiences? Do you enjoy talking about this type of research with the public or with other scholars?
Yes. So this was regarding the day when I was talking.
Oh, you're breaking up, Marlene. Can you still hear us? Marlene, are you still with us? It looks like you might be coming back. Marlene, are you still able to hear us?
Am I back now?
Yeah, it seems like you are. Hey, can you hear us okay? Hey, excellent.
Wonderful.
I'm so sorry. Can you take that question from the beginning?
So the prompt you yes. So the prompt you used when thinking about how to explain my research interests was related to engineering students. and being able to explain it to someone like that. Just the other day, I was talking to one of friends that I've not seen in a while, and I was explaining to him what my topic is about. And so being able to elaborate to someone in a simple sense that not everyone that studies, even the people just roughly interested in ancient Egypt, not necessarily understanding how the land of Egypt was separated the two different parts, Upper and Lower Egypt, and the constant conflict between these areas and rulers and disagreements between the two opposing areas. It's interesting to be able to explain to people that this was an actual culture that still had conflicts within it.
Absolutely. That's such a great opportunity to practice sort of synthesizing how you're thinking about your research and describing it for different audiences. That's a lot of fun. We have another question from the audience. How did you become interested in Egyptology in general? What set you down this path?
I think my parents would like to believe that when we went to Egypt in 2005, I was a little 8-year-old girl. They hoped that imprint on me, while I believe the biggest reason was the Rick Riordan books. So Rick Riordan, he also wrote the Percy Jackson. I preferred in Chronicles as being based on Egyptian deities, not the Greek gods like Percy Jackson. And that's where I first got introduced into the pantheon and all the different types of gods and their culture mainly. And so that sort of spiraled into me. Yeah.
That's wonderful. It's great seeing whole generations of people who grew up on Egyptology presented through these very public spaces as a way of bringing them into scholarly, rigorous research. There are so many connections throughout the field. We have another question from the audience too. How did the ancient Egyptians use the motif that you're exploring?
So the different scenarios we've found the motif being used in, mainly they were used as, you have it as the title of the king, so the uniter of Upper and Lower Egypt. So part of his royal names, you'll have within it them the uniter of Upper and Lower Egypt, while in other cases it's just being on the side of the throne base. One tends to interpret it rather as a statement of "look what I achieved," or more in I wouldn't say oppressive, but rather through a type of way.
Interesting. It's interesting to see such variety in the ways that it's used. Does the motif appear through all of ancient Egyptian history, or do you find it limited to a specific dynasty or specific time period?
Can you hear me? I'm wondering if I might be breaking up again.
You were, it turns out. I'm so sorry. We can hear you though now. Can you hear us okay?
Yes. Thanks.
Excellent.
So yeah, the motif first appeared in the first dynasty. So very early on, 3000, 4000 BCE, before Common Era. While the latest I have decided to end my research on was 400 CE, so Common Era or AD. So it's quite a big span that you see the motif being used in from early on to late as well.
Interesting. Do you see it? The language changes over that such a long span of time, right? We don't just have one static Egyptian language throughout that entire time period. Do you see the hieroglyphs that it's associated with change as well over that time period?
Yes, so especially the form of the house that I'm delving into currently. So every single nook and cranny, crevice, change in the way they made a zigzag is all developing in my region. So one noting previously that the Sematawi was rather written as individual hieroglyphs, like a sentence, while later on it started to combine and mold into a single symbol. So in the uh, Gardner sign list of Egyptian hieroglyphs, you'll see the individual symbols as well as one that is combined.
Very cool. For people interested at home, can you speak a little bit about the Gardner sign list as a basic tool for the Egyptologist?
Yeah, so the Gardner sign list is basically a way of cataloging hieroglyphs. So you get different categories A, B, C, and within these categories, A being humans, you would get A1 being a person sitting, A2 being a person standing. So you get these catalog of individual signs so that one day when you uh, go to a relief or you see a new manuscript, you are able to identify, oh, this hieroglyph is this. So it's an easier tool for people to be able to understand what the sign is if it's not completely legible.
Which is often the case, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So on that note, can you to pull you back to getting these images from museums to continue your research? Can you speak a little bit about these two-dimensional photographic representations of especially some of the monumental forms that this motif might take? Are there any intricacies or difficulties when you're dealing with photographs instead of looking at, say, the actual inscription?
The bigger one is the quality of the image. So often, um, either the pictures, most of the images that I currently use for my study is from 1984. So the manuscript that I have, they have like these little itty bitty images, and for you to be able to see how many lines are there on a certain part of the image is very difficult because you can't necessarily enlarge it enough. While in times, people will often take a general photo of a statue and not necessarily focus on the side of the statue. And so you don't necessarily get what uh, encompasses the Sematawi.
Do you work with any existing images that are just the hand drawings that they did for those studies that were done before even photographs were a common tool for Egyptologists?
Yes, I have found some of those hand-drawn images, but they're mostly mixed in between currently in my database. So it's not a standardized system as of yet. So currently busy with my thesis, I'm slowly drawing my own images of the images that of the artifacts that I have been able to allocate, so that I will be able to better describe to in my uh, what I'm referring to when I talk about the zigzag lines.
That's exciting. So this line art, this drawing is also a part of your research project for this then?
Yes, yeah.
Very cool. Can you talk
I'm
a little bit?
basically grouping the individual.
Please continue.
I'm basically grouping the individual elements within the motif in with different types and see the and sort of match them within the single image. Yeah.
That's exciting. This sounds like a very cool project. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today, Marlene. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
No, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be.
Well, totally our pleasure. We're going to take a little bit of a break right now, and then we'll be back with our next candidate, and we'll have a great conversation with them as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Scholarship Interviews. I'm joined now by Edward. Edward, thanks for chatting with us today.
Hi there. Great. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Totally our pleasure. Can you start by introducing yourself, letting us know where you're talking to us from?
Yeah. So I'm Edward Ross. I'm from Canada originally, but I'm currently doing my PhD at the University of Reading in classics. I'm a final year. I'm willing that, but that's where I'm at. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, almost congratulations then, but definite congratulations for being here today. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your research interests are over there?
Yeah. So my current PhD research is on the lived religious experiences of people in Hellenistic Bactria. So I'm referring to the region that's now what we know as the intersection of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And it's a sort of river valley between some very massive mountains. And these were people that lived in the region following the conquests of Alexander the Great. So we have Iranian people coming from Bactria itself, but also from the Near East. We have people coming from South Asia, from East Asia over through the northern passes, and then also the Greeks and Macedonians, which invaded and settled some people in there. And so I primarily look at the religious experience of these people and how they coexisted, but then also culturally blended and performed religious practices and engaged with their religious identities in this new region.
Sounds a bit like a melting pot. You're getting tons of
Yeah.
different cultures and languages. What sorts of religions do you find mixing or converging in this area?
Yeah, from what I've been looking at, mostly I see lots of ancient Greek and Macedonian stuff. I see stuff coming from South Asia. One of my main pushes here is the idea that Buddhism was integrated into Central Asia a bit earlier than we'd like to believe, at least with our current evidence, because early Buddhism wasn't really a physical religion up until the turn of the millennium. So most of the stuff that we'd have there would have just been circumstantial more than anything. But so Greek, then Iranian stuff coming from Bactria itself, but then also from the Achaemenids, so the Near Eastern Persian Empire that held rule over this area. Also some stuff traveling along trade routes as well. So a wide variety of traditions all in the same place.
Very cool. What types of evidence do you have of these mixing religions and cultures? Is it linguistic, physical?
Yeah, so the problem mainly with this region is that almost all of the textual evidence has disappeared. The most that we have is a couple tax documents that have been inscribed on some pots. Other than that, all we have to trust is the outside sources. So we got stuff coming from Rome, from Greece, from China, Tibet, India, all kinds of different stuff that is talking about this region, but nothing from the region itself. So for religious studies, largely we believe in this idea that the believer is the one that truly understands the tradition. So it's hard to say what they believed without having what they thought or believed. So the closest we got is the archaeological evidence. And this stuff is coming from Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. We have a couple sites with stuff in there. And we found these ritual objects have mainly been looking at votive offerings, particularly in a very strange, fancy, metal bones kinds of offerings, but then also simplistic ones like just river stones that have been taken from one river to another location, just to indicate some kind of meaning between these people. Inverted pots, little types of liquid residue, things like that. Even just temple spaces where we have different styles of art sort of intersecting. And then also types of objects, ritual objects that are culturally ambiguous per se. So it may appear to be either some kind of motif coming from a Greek region or maybe a South Asian region or maybe the Iranian region, but we don't really know because, again, no one's telling us. We just have to perceive it. So it's mainly we're looking at archaeological evidence that has questionable provenance because we don't know where exactly most of it's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But we do have a bunch, so there is stuff. But yes, archaeology, that's our biggest source.
That's fascinating. This sounds like such an interesting research project. What are your plans then for the summer, and how can the HAPS scholarship and HAPS funding help you achieve them?
Yeah, so right now, as I said, I'm in my final year, so most of my time right now is spent on writing. Done a lot of research. Unfortunately, I never got to go to any of these regions because one, COVID, on top of also most of these areas being a bit tenuous at times. I was meant to go to Pakistan last year, but unfortunately there were some situations that made it impossible to go. But now this summer, I'm planning on doing some more research with stuff that's more local. So I've mostly been writing, but I do need to add some more information to my idea in terms, especially about both the Persian and Iranian tradition. So I plan to be doing some research at museums in the UK, and I also plan to be presenting some of my research at 2 conferences up at St. Andrews in Scotland. I'll be talking about my ideas about geography and how religious geography can be translated across locations with migrating peoples, and then also talking about the importance of mountains in Central Asian religious ideology. Yeah.
Well, I don't want you to spill the beans, but can you tell us a little bit about what the importance of mountains is?
Well, the main thing that we think about for especially mountains in this region too, for especially the people that are coming from the far west, we got people from Greece, Macedon, so on and so forth. The mountains that they have over there were not as extremely large as we would see in the Pamirs and in the Himalayas and in the Hindu Kush. It's quite a stark contrast. And so the main idea I want to be talking about is that although they're massive and they're scary, they were more traversable than other things. So you would go through the mountain passes. They were scary, they were difficult, but they were things that you had to grapple with to make your way through. But then also this idea that a mountain can represent something sacred, and a sacred mountain to one place may also be, oh, well, I think that this god is at the top of a mountain, and that mountain looks identical to the one I have back home. So maybe that god is also over here. And so this is the idea where we see these people translating their religious experience across places. We do see this in the modern day. So I don't think it's very hard to believe that in the ancient world, whenever they would move across great distances, they'd want to connect with their homeland, with what they saw in a different place.
That sounds fascinating and believable to me, for what it's worth. We have some questions coming in from the audience. Did you find some connection to old Mesopotamian religion? For example, the sun god, the moon god, Inanna-style goddesses?
Well, from what I've seen, there have been in the scholarship, especially because, like I've said, a lot of the objects that we have, they have allusions to different cultural groups. And there is no obvious one to say one or the other. For example, we have a silver medallion coming from the city of Iconium, which is located in eastern Afghanistan, if you want to look that up. But we have this silver medallion that some people have said is Kybele, a Greek goddess. Other people are saying that it is an Iranian goddess coming from the Mesopotamian tradition. I think, who is it? The name is escaping me at the moment, but a water goddess specifically. But so the point is being that the iconography because of the nature of this study, because we're at the intersection of so many different cultural study groups. So we have people coming, from classics, we have people coming from Indology, we have people coming from Chinese studies, Buddhist studies, we have people coming, from Assyriology, so on and so forth, all viewing these objects from their own perspectives. We have so many different views about the same objects, where in my work, I don't want to say one or the other because that would cause too much trouble. But that being said, there have been interpretations of the evidence to suggest that there are indeed Mesopotamian deities occurring in these traditions. And I would be wrong to say that it isn't possible.
Fascinating. We have another question from the audience. When you're looking at intercultural connections, how do you identify similarities that are a result of points of contact rather than common ideas that were developed in 2 different places?
So that's a very good point. The one to think about is just the nature how every society views the moon, every society views the sun, right? How can we say that one invented this idea versus the other? And the fact is that we can't. We just have different ways of interpreting these things. The main way that I consider this is that, and especially this is a question I've been dealing with a lot recently, is the idea that it is the origin super important, because the nature is, because we don't know, we can't hear from these people. We don't have the actual written sources from these people saying what they said this was. Like, this statue was Zeus. Well, we don't know that. We don't know what they say. But how crucial is that origin, when the fact is it was sacred and it represented this idea? What we could see is it being these objects as being a point of contact for a variety of people from different contexts. And they all could view it differently, but use it the same. Or say we have a statue. There is a main cult statue, say in the city of Icanoom, bringing back to this, which is ambiguous, and a lot of people have said different things, because all we have is the foot, a sandaled foot. That's all that's left. And people have said it's a sky god. Some people have said it's a fertility god, so on and so forth. But the important thing I want to draw from this is that these objects could have been viewed by every single person differently. Like, whenever, say, you walk into a temple and you see a statue of a specific deity, to you, it looks like one thing, but the person next to you might see something completely different, but still engage with it as being a spiritual experience. And so that's this idea where points of contact are so deeply individual and so deeply separate, as well as being associated. So my work especially is moving past this idea of, this is Greek, this is Iranian, this is this, and instead saying it's a spiritual experience and people used it for that purpose.
I like that. Very synthetic, very bringing things together. I want to pull you back to your description of your research interests and ask you, maybe meanly, I hope it's not too mean, to talk about a term you used, which is the idea of lived religious experience. Can you talk about what that means in comparison to the alternative to lived religious experience?
Yeah. So whenever we think of ancient religion, I think a lot of people tend to think of this idea, lived religion was this temple, and people were in this temple, priests did things, and that was religion. It's a thing that was separate. It was in this box, and that's where it was. Like we think of today, how things are in churches, things are in temples, synagogues, so on and so forth. And we think of religion as being something itemized. And whenever I explain lived religion, it's this idea of it permeates everything. We experience life, spirituality, and especially in the ancient world, I believe, and I sort of argue, is that we felt spirituality in our life on a daily basis. Everything you did, in a way, was connected to the spiritualism or the way that you viewed the world. And we lived through that experience. And so I'm pitching this ancient religion in a way that every aspect was connected in a way, but it wasn't the overarching theme per se. Like, you thanked the deity for good weather. You thanked the deity for being able to work or good health, so on and so forth. These were things that it was part of the cosmology and the way the world worked. The weather was good, so we can do things. Okay, great. I have faith that it will keep going, so on and so forth. But yes, lived religion is being that it permeates life. And that's the main idea I want to get across there.
Does that sort of open up more, especially archaeological sources, as sources not just of warfare or daily life, but also then of religious and spiritual life as well?
Yes. So I'm on the toe line here, because there's a general tendency in archaeology to say anything we don't understand is religion. There is a very much tendency of that. And definitely, especially how you say that, the idea that every object can be taken with a layer of spirituality in existence, so on in that way, where everything permeates, right? A weapon could be something that was given to you by a deity. It was created in concept by a deity and given to you, so you're thankful for that, and then you can use it and so forth. Same thing with food, same thing with pots. Something was created in a way, and everything can have a dimension of religiousness or spirituality or belief in that way.
All right. So you mentioned that you have people who are working in your area are coming from many different areas, right? They're coming from Sinology or Assyriology or Indology. How did you end up studying this area? What brought you into looking at the religion of Bactria?
So basically, I fell on it, really. Whenever, as a kid, I was always really interested in Greek stuff. I like ancient Greek myths. I read the stories. I read Percy Jackson. I did all that stuff. I loved it. And I always just found I really enjoyed the iconography of everything. And whenever I went to my undergrad, I went to McGill. I took a variety of classes, but I took my first Intro to East Asian Religions class. And I sat in, and the first day he showed us a picture of Amitabha Buddha from Japan, specifically the Golden Light Buddha, which is meant to be a syncretized version of a Shinto goddess and a Buddha. And it was that connection there. And I saw that, and I was like, I like this. And so I got really into Buddhism, and I studied Buddhism all through. So I did a double degree where I did honors in classics and honors in East Asian religion. And so I did all of that, and I came together that I want to do something, but I can't find a connection between the two. And a friend told me, oh, have you ever heard of the Greek Buddhists? And that was it. And they all lived in Bactria. And then that's how it all came together. I found out about Bactria, and I kept going from there.
That's beautiful. That's such a good story. Yeah. And it made both me and the audience want to ask you, hey, what's syncretism? Can you talk about what you mean by a synchronized version?
Yeah. So syncretism, again, I slipped. I don't like using that word, but it's specifically because syncretism, in terms of whenever I think of Bactria, is not relevant. Okay. But whenever I think of other things, like specifically that Buddha, it's very important. Because syncretism is this idea where you get two traditions, different traditions, not opposing, but different traditions, taking ideas and then blending together to create something completely new. So you're creating something new from different traditions. And where with that Buddha, right, was coming from this Buddhist idea and Shinto ideas in Japan, coming together, and then two different people were looking at it and they could see it in both contexts. And it was something entirely new. When we think, syncretism itself is the creation of something new when you're blending traditions together. Okay. When we think of Bactria, it's not so much there was a new tradition there, it was a sort of mosaic of traditions coming together to coexist. So that's why, with my own personal research in here, I don't use the term, but it's a great term to think about things like where we see temples with a variety of deities in the same context, but creating something completely new.
That's an interesting nuance. I like that a lot. Can you speak a little bit? I know you've got these conferences planned for the summer for talking about your research with audiences who are maybe already interested or familiar with this area. Have you had much opportunity to chat with more public or general audiences? And how has that experience been for you?
Well, I will say a lot of the time, I've only ever spoken at 2 conferences over my entire PhD with people who know what I'm talking about.
Thanks,
9 times. Yeah, 9 times out of 10, I go to a conference and I talk about one aspect of my research, and that will be okay to them. Then everything else, they'll just be like, I don't know what you're talking about, but it sounds good. I'm happy with that, which is usually what happens. And it's one of my overarching experiences with my PhD. But especially for this summer, hopefully, we'll see how it goes. But I'm talking with 2 different groups. We'll see. But when I speak publicly about this stuff, it's very much the same idea where I bring it down. And a lot of my time, especially presenting at conferences now, is I always have a slide at the beginning to say, this is the region I'm talking about. This is what I'm doing. This is here I am, to give people context. And it's really helpful for me, especially to think of it in a way that is broader, because it makes my writing clearer and it makes everything a bit more accessible. That's always been one of my things to say. I want this to be read by someone who had no idea what I'm talking about when they start the book, but when they finish, it makes sense and they get it. And that was primarily my goal there. And when I think of scholarship in general and publicly talking about things, it's been so helpful for me, especially as a person who has to talk things out in order to understand them completely. It's great practice for me, and I really enjoy it.
It's always good when you can enjoy the process as well when you're talking with audiences. We have another question from our audience. Speaking of, do you think that this melting pot area, people lived the religions and labels for gods were less important? They celebrated, for example, a mountain god, whatever the different name could be.
The main reason why I say that they aren't important is because we can't ever, with what we have, unless we suddenly find a book that was buried in some pit that says, we studied these gods, we did this, this, and this. We will never be able to know who was who and what was what. We can just allude to these ideas. And I think, especially with the study of this, it's not important to focus on these ideas. It's more important to focus on what they did and why they did it. And so that's why I'm very much this idea of labels are not important for the scholars. To them, it might have been, but they didn't really write it down during this period. And we have no evidence to suggest otherwise. So it could have been important. I just think for the study of the religion of the area, it's not as crucial because it's very polarizing in an unnecessary way, and it causes more opposition than unification.
Sure. Fascinating. Well, this sounds like a really interesting research topic, and I'm so thankful that you shared it with us today. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me.
Totally our pleasure. We're going to take a little break, and we'll be back with more interviews in just a few minutes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship interviews. Thank you very much to EL for taking the first half of today's stream. I am Megan. I run HAPS, ably assisted by board members like EL. I run Digital Hammurabi as well, and I am thrilled to be joined by Peter. Peter, hello, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Peter has some slides to share that are, for some reason, not showing up.
No, Can you see them now?
No.
Okay, let me try something else.
Aha. Okay.
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Very
so
good.
We've got your entire screen there.
Very good. Okay, great. So again, yeah, thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to speak a little bit about my research. So I wanted to start by giving you kind of an overall introduction to my research, my interests, and of course how this grant would assist me in continuing it. So again,
sorry, Peter, just before you get into it, I can see your screen, but I can't see any slides.
You cannot see my slides. Okay, I am in full slide mode. So not sure why this is not working. Would there be another way to share the?
Yes, if you you can, if you want to just email me your slides, I can get them up, and you can just let me know when you want to go to the next one.
Perfect, great.
Sorry, everyone, it would not be a Digital Hammurabi stream without some kind of technical snafu. I appreciate everyone's patience. We'll get this going as soon as we can.
So I have just sent it.
Okay, wonderful. Peter, while we're waiting for me to figure this out, would you mind just telling everyone who you are and where you're speaking from?
Exactly, yes. So again, hi everyone. Again, Peter, I'm a PhD candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. And I am in New York City right now. For anyone else who is on the East Coast, I hope you're also enjoying this beautiful spout of weather that we are having. And really excited to speak to folks, obviously, across the large swath of reach that you have, and tell people about my research.
How did you get into Egyptology?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, like many folks, I had a really engaging instructor who kind of lured me away from what was an interest in classics at the time, and really gave me some exciting evidence. And for me, it was just kind of the allure of working with some pieces of evidence that had had a little less treatment, and just, of course, I think like many folks who are interested in the ancient world, the desire to travel the globe, meet people who are from many different and diverse cultures. And so what I really love about Egyptology, and I would even kind of describe myself as a art historian and archaeologist of Northeast Africa, is that you really do get to meet people from all different walks of life, and you get to really make these amazing connections between antiquity and modernity, which I think are just so important. So I actually cannot hear you, Megan.
No, sorry, I mute myself when I'm fiddling around on the computer so people don't get my the noise of my keyboard, and then I often forget to unmute. But we have slides, so why don't you take it away and let me know when you want the next one?
Perfect, great. So again, why don't you go to the next one? So I'm going to briefly introduce my research interests and talk about my project. And the broad name of my dissertation project, of which this grant would support, is called Ethiopia Abroad: The Role of Kush in a Network of Cultural Exchange in the Greater Mediterranean, 663 to 404 BC. But I really want to situate folks kind of where I'm talking about geographically, and also within the time period. So as my main research is in Nubia, which is a geographical region situated within the boundaries of modern-day Sudan. And I've included a map here just so folks can kind of situate themselves. This region is punctuated by the Nile River, and this is the Middle Nile Valley, and was home to a number of different civilizations throughout antiquity and to the modern day. However, when most people think about the Nile and the Nile River Valley, Egypt is probably the first thing that comes to mind. And Nubia has often received short shrift in academic scholarship. If we could advance the next slide. And so the period that I specifically look at is a really exciting period in the first millennium BC. And I've included just a brief chart here so folks can situate themselves within the time period. And I study what is called the Napatan period. You can see that on the right, which is approximately 1000 to 300 BC. Or this is also often known as the Kingdom of Kush. And this comes from the Egyptian word for the Nubians. And so this is a really exciting kingdom because it's one of the most well archaeologically attested kingdoms in Nubia, in kind of sub-Saharan Africa, and one of the earliest actually that we have attested in all of sub-Saharan Africa. And this kingdom is most often well known for one of its accomplishments, which was to conquer all of Egypt during a period which has been known as Egypt's 25th dynasty. This was a period when these native Nubian Sudanese kings kind of went north through the Nile River Valley and conquered Egypt and actually ruled as Egyptian pharaohs. So if you could progress to the next slide. So I've included two kind of creatively rendered images here that have kind of permeated the cultural zeitgeist. This is a period often known as the Black Pharaohs. So you can see on the right here, we have an image from National Geographic. At one point, there was even going to be a film, maybe with Will Smith a couple years ago, playing kind of one of these triumphant pharaohs. But it really captures the popular imagination that you have this kingdom, this Napatan or Kushite kingdom, which is able to take over all of Egypt. But this is just 100 years of this approximately 700-year period known as the Napatan kind of rule, or the Kushite kingdom. So what happens after the Nubians leave Egypt? This is something that's actually much less well known. And if you could progress to the next slide. So the kings have left a number of pieces of archaeological and artistic evidence, and I've just included a group of statues here, which really nicely show that these kings were using some really traditional Egyptian styles and forms, but kind of altering it to make it their own. And if you could progress to the following slide. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I just want to note that there are a number of kind of artistic styles that have become really characteristically identified as Nubians within kind of this cultural moment. And these include many aspects of bodily adornment. So the way that crowns are rendered, certain aspects like rams that we see on these statues, even the rendering of kind of a fleshiness of the face and certain folds in the musculature. But again, this is really well attested for this 100-year period where the kings are in Egypt, but then after they leave in the mid-7th century, what happens? So if you could progress the next slide. We see here that the Assyrians actually expel the Kushites. This happens in the mid-7th century. We see again between the 8th and 7th centuries, the Assyrians vastly expand their network. So the Nubians at this point are kind of blasted off, let's say, this world, a greater global Mediterranean stage. The kind of triumphant kind of conquest they had been known for in the kind of upper Nile River Valley become lesser known, and Nubians are kind of relegated to a very cloistered role within Sudan itself. And in fact, we don't really hear much about them for the next few hundred years. In fact, there is actually even a textual language called Meroitic, which has still yet to be fully deciphered. So we kind of have somewhat of a dark age, we could call it, from approximately the mid-7th century through the 5th century, where we don't really know what's happening with Nubians. So again, I want to give folks kind of a sense of the global, I'll call it global, but really greater Mediterranean stage here. So if you could progress to the next slide. We see that after the Assyrians come into Egypt, we then in the mid-6th century see that we have the rise of some of the Greek and Phoenician states. And the greater Mediterranean kind of traditional histories tend to really be looking at this time towards the Greek states. And finally, if we look, if you could progress to the next slide, to the 6th century and into the 5th, we see that we have the rise of the Persian Empire. So again, we're getting the rise of some of these traditional actors that we're kind of, again, very familiar with in the greater Mediterranean. But where are the Nubians? What has happened to this really great culture and civilization, which actually was able to conquer all of the traditional Egyptian territory? Have they really gone into obscurity? So we do have some textual sources, but about who they are and what happened to them, but all of them are actually written by foreign observers. So if you could progress to the next slide, we have this really great passage from Herodotus where he talks and he says the following: where the south declines towards the setting sun lies a country called Ethiopia. This was his term for Nubia, the last inhabited land in that direction. There gold is obtained in great plenty, huge elephants abound, with wild trees of all sorts and ebony, and the men are taller, handsomer, longer lived than anywhere else. So Nubia has now actually kind of been factored by some of these early classical historians into kind of a figment of an idealized imagination. Many of these writers likely have never actually gone to Nubia itself, and they only know of it through certain tales, or more importantly, kind of what products this country is able to produce. Nubia has always been known as a region which was very materially resource rich. Think of gold, think of ivory tusks, and even certain incense coming from this region. And so again, this is kind of what Herodotus is hitting on here. And this is kind of, again, the role that Nubia has now been cast in this early classical period in the second half of the first millennium BCE. But for me, this was kind of not satisfactory. I wanted to know, okay, well, again, this was a civilization which was able to rule over Egypt for 100 years. Have they really now just gone into obscurity, and are we really just thinking of them only as a region to be pillaged for their material wealth? Well, if you could progress to the next slide, I actually went back to, again, some of these artistic precedents that they set during this kind of rule over Egypt. And I'm using this as the jumping off point for my dissertation. My question really is here: how can we construct a history, or at least understand the influence of these Nubian peoples over a period where they tend to be lesser known? And I'm specifically looking at the artistic evidence. Again, because the textual histories really leave us with such a gap, and they're only written by outside actors. So how can we look at the material objects that Nubians created and produced? Not only that, but how can we look at these objects as they circulated among these greater Mediterranean empires that start to arise during this approximately 200, 250 year period? So if you could progress to the next slide. My research really uses a number of different types of artistic evidence. I look at temple reliefs, I look at funerary stelae, and I also look at statuary. These are all objects that I call objects of self-presentation. These are objects where individuals are able to, by identifying themselves through the body, are able to tell us more about who they are and how they identify. And so what I'm really doing here is looking at how this Nubian kingly presence in Egypt over the preceding 100-year period has a lasting impact on the objects that were left behind. And my main argument here is that within the private sphere, outside of this royal sphere, you have the kind of continued influence of Nubians circulating within this local context. So previously, a lot of the assumptions were that the Egyptians kind of hated the Nubians. They hated being ruled by these foreigners who were kind of in their land. And a lot of traditional histories kind of say that when they were expelled by the Assyrians, the Egyptians were happy to have them gone. But a lot of the artistic evidence that I will be looking at paints a very different story. It will show that Nubians continued to live within Egyptian contexts for hundreds of years following, and were actually very welcomed into Egyptian society, and that their identities were really able to mesh into Egyptian culture. Now, I have a number of slides that give a lot of examples of more of the type of artistic evidence that I'll be looking at, and I don't want to touch on all of them, although I certainly can go to some of them in the questions. But I really want to hit on here that, part of my main research will be compiling a corpus. And this is a corpus of objects that exist in collections around Northeast Africa, Egypt, Sudan, Europe, and also North America. And I'll be working in museum collections, and we'll be kind of piecing together this corpus that really nicely tells the story of Nubian influence abroad, of these people who continued to have a presence on the global stage during a period when they were thought to, again, be quite cloistered in the country of Sudan. And so my work really is to be working in these collections, taking photographs, documenting objects which have not been properly documented, then also tracing some of these stylistic changes. So the HAPS grant will really nicely support my work in these collections. Specifically, this summer I'll be working at the MFA in Boston, as well as the formerly named Oriental Institute in Chicago. And apologies, I haven't completely gotten the new acronym down on my tongue. And so the HAPS grant will really help me to fund my travel and stay in those two cities as I look at these really wonderful collections that have some of these objects that I think can really tell an important story. And for me, again, at the crux of my research, that's really what this is about. It's about telling a story about a civilization and a people who I think haven't had their full importance and history yet told, especially when they're having such, I think, an important influence on the kind of global stage during this time. So again, I have many more images that I'd be willing to kind of go through, but I want to make sure we have some time for some conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. That was really fascinating. And looking at the Kushites and the Kushite dynasty is always really interesting to me, because it's one of those things that 100 years, that's not an insubstantial amount of time.
Exactly.
But it seems like that hasn't filtered down into like the popular cultural knowledge about Egypt that maybe we would want it to be present in.
Yeah. So I think again, that's something that's really exciting to me, is that, as you mentioned, so much of our knowledge is filtered through Egypt, is filtered through this pharaonic period and this 25th dynasty. And so what's exciting for me to think about is when these Nubians are no longer considered kings, right? How can we then look at their evidence? How can we look at how they've continued to kind of have influence within these communities that they have no doubt been integrated in? So if you actually want to maybe progress 2 more slides forward. Yeah, this one's perfect. You can see that here I actually have some examples of some statuary that are actually kind of derivative or have some stylistic precedence in some of the kingly antecedents that I showed previously in my presentation. So this would be a great example where I'm looking at some statuary and evidence, and these are private individuals. Certainly they're well-off individuals, but these are not kings. They are really not setting, let's say, the style or cultural norm in the same way that kings can do. So what's exciting here is that we're able to look at how Nubians within private contexts are able to take some of these kingly forms that were previously so popular and so important and adopt them in a very different way. And again, I think this shows that the everyday Egyptians were very comfortable with Nubians living among them. And they really didn't think of this kind of Nubian rule as some sort of overstepping. And again, I think in much of our traditional histories of Egyptology, we think of foreign rule as periods of kind of bad times. This is times when people really didn't know how to truly rule Egypt. And I think we can kind of start to tell a different story here.
Thank you. We have just a couple of audience questions before I let you go that I want to make sure we get to. So first question, are there any archaeological evidence of diplomatic relationships between the Nubians and the Assyrians?
So we do have some archaeological evidence. Particularly, we have evidence of some Assyrian armor, which is found in Nubian contexts. So this is really exciting to us because we assume, again, that these are two kind of head-to-head adversaries, right? The Assyrians have kind of expelled the Nubians from Egypt. But also, I think, too, what you have to remember here is that likely there would have been a ton of resource trading. I can't overstep how important it is that the Nubians controlled so much of the area and access to the gold mines, and also to the elephant ivory coming from like the Sahelian reaches and further south. And so, while certainly there's a lot of tension, I think, between these peoples during this time, there's also evidence that there's a lot of diplomatic trading. And if you move forward to I have a slide with some ivories. This one is perfect. You can actually see this kind of nicely played out. These are two different types of plaques displaying Nubians. And the one on the right actually is Assyrian. It comes from Nimrud. The one on the left is a Achaemenid and comes from Susa. Well, what's so interesting here, and another aspect of this project, is looking at how the materials themselves that are being sourced from Nubia then display images that depict Nubians in certain ways. So here you can see on the right, the Assyrian one shows the Nubian actually being attacked, right? This is a very traditional Egyptian way of showing a Nubian being subjugated. But the one on the left, the Achaemenid example, shows the Nubian in a very different posture and actually kind of elevates them. So part of my argument here is showing how this change in idea around Nubian identity, how these people are to be portrayed, changes over this a couple 100-year period, and also kind of changes to align with the importance that these people continue to have in this greater Mediterranean landscape.
Thank you so much. And our next question is asking how the Kushites used Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Yes, super interesting. So again, the Nubians and Egyptians were very often in contact with one another for many thousands of years. So when the Nubians, again, conquered Egypt, it's very likely that they, again, employed scribes, Egyptian scribes who were already fluent in writing in Egyptian hieroglyphs. What's interesting about the Nubian use of Egyptian hieroglyphs is that they actually use a very traditional, we would call Middle Egyptian kind of scribal, very kind of old religious way of writing. So by this time in Egyptian, the common vernacular would be what we're called late Egyptian. So this is really a kind of attesting to the fact that the Nubians, when they are ruling over Egypt, actually want to return to what they consider kind of the traditional high glory days. So they really beautifully kind of use these scribes to master this old kind of Middle Egyptian that's kind of considered quite classical in language, to show that even though they're foreigners ruling over this country, they're doing so in a very kind of proper way. They're using the language in the way it should be intended, as opposed to a more kind of lay vernacular that many of the people in the streets would have spoken.
That's fascinating. And do we see Egyptian hieroglyphs being used in Nubia, or is this purely restricted to Nubians living in Egypt?
Sure. So they are being used in Nubia. Again, this is, although a completely royal prerogative during, again, the period at which the Nubians rule over Egypt. After they're expelled from Egypt, we don't see much use of Egyptian hieroglyphic much anymore, until we see the rise of a language that we assume follows Egyptian hieroglyphic called Meroitic. This happens around 300 BC or to 300 AD, the Meroitic period. And this is kind of what we assume is a kind of combination of this Egyptian language with some kind of native kind of Nubian dialects.
Thank you. And I'm going to sneak in one more question before I let you go. So a YouTube commenter says that the Kushites ruling for 100 years means that there were Egyptians who lived their entire lives with a purely Nubian rule.
Yep.
Do we know how much everyday life would have been impacted by having a Nubian pharaoh, or would it have been mostly just a continuation of business as usual?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, right? It's how do we get at those really minute examples? So I think one of the exciting things for me that I'm looking at is I'm looking at some things like offering tables to help tell us this practice. So offering tables are these, they could be ceramic or stone tables that would be used in funerary contexts. And when a family member visited a deceased tomb, this is a place where they could leave literal offerings, but the table itself is incised with images of what the offerings may be. This is a practice that was initiated in the middle and became kind of common in the New Kingdom in Egypt, but it completely fell out of favor after the New Kingdom. The Nubians are actually reinstate this practice. They say, this is something that we love. The Nubians have a long tradition of using a lot of milk and libation rituals, pouring of kind of fluids as part of their ritual practices. So we have evidence that this is a practice that the Nubians revitalized and only is found in Nubian graves. But then after the expulsion of the Nubians, Egyptians then retake up this practice. So it's really cool because we can see that the Nubians are kind of taking this old Egyptian practice. They're saying, well, this now aligns with our use of libation rituals. We can combine it. And then the Egyptians are saying, oh, well, we used to do this. The Nubians kind of brought it back. So we're going to continue using it again. So it's a really great example of something where we can see that, the normal Egyptian probably isn't having their day-to-day life change in drastic ways, but kind of some of these smaller kind of day-to-day religious practices can then seep into the larger Egyptian culture and then change how everyday Egyptians are practicing their religion.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to let you go, but again, thank you for joining us, Peter. It was a delight to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Have a good weekend. Okay, everyone, we have our next guest ready and waiting to go. So I'm going to bring him in and we will continue with our HAPS interviews, my favorite time of the year, because I love hearing about everyone's research. Remember, if you have questions, put them in the live chat and I will relay them. We have Chris. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Megan. Good evening from Athens.
It's nice to meet you. Could you give everyone a little bit of background to who you are, what you're working on, and where you are currently in the world?
Sure. My name is Chris Lindsay. I'm a part-time PhD student at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, Lampeter. And going back through my academic degrees, I did my undergraduate in ancient history and archaeology, where I had a personal focus on the 17th to 18th dynasty Egypt. And then afterwards, I went into my MA degree at Swansea University in ancient Egyptian culture. That too was part-time. And while I was studying for my part-time master's, I was also working full-time as a contract archaeologist around the UK. So by day digging, by the evening, Middle Egyptian grammar. It was very intense, but I did enjoy it. And now I'm in the 4th year of my part-time PhD. Still working in the commercial sector in archaeology when I'm there, but otherwise I'm a long-term excavator at the Palace of Nestor project in southwest Greece.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a really interesting background. And I love the breadth of your academic and archaeological experience. That's wonderful. What are your current research interests as far as your PhD goes?
So my research looks at the reception and perception of 2 Bronze Age Aegean cultures, the Helladic culture, otherwise known as the Mycenaean culture of mainland Greece, and most predominantly the Cretan culture, commonly known as the Minoan culture from Crete. And I look at them from the point of view of the ancient Egyptian world.
So can you, for our audience, maybe unpack that a little bit and explain exactly what that means practically?
Sure. So I look at the way in which Crete and mainland Bronze Age cultures come into contact with the ancient Egyptian world, predominantly through text, but also in the deposition of material culture, and through art as well, how these influences permeate into the culture in tomb paintings, or perhaps in sort of syncretic hybridized objects, predominantly for the major elites of ancient Egyptian society.
Thank you. And is there a particular time period that this research focuses on?
Yeah, so I've taken it to look at this period in a chronological bracket of about 1900 to 1300 BC, which covers Egypt's Middle Kingdom through to the Second Intermediate Period, which is the fragmentation of the Egyptian state, where they've lost control of northern Egypt and the Delta by means of the Hyksos settling, and also there is applied pressure to their southern border by the Kushites. And I go all the way through to the end of the 18th dynasty, which proved to be Pharaonic Egypt's most wealthy, military expansive, and interconnected period.
Thank you very much. When then you're looking at connections between these Aegean cultures and the Egyptian civilization, is this a direct contact? Are you having people from the Aegean going to Egypt, or is this more things like trade through middlemen?
Well, so it's in the 18th dynasty through the texts that we get a geographical reference to a place called Keftiu, which scholars have made strong associations with Crete. And we also, from the same dynasty, get a reference to a place called Chanayu, which is thought to reference the Greek mainland by their association with Keftiu in Egyptian texts, but also is possibly a cognate with a place called Hayawa, which is mentioned in late Bronze Age letters around the 13th to 12th century BC from Turkey, who are an adjacent power to the Hittites, who are found to disagree and resolve matters in an area called Wiliusha, I think it's called, and it's the site associated with Troy. So we think that this is possibly the reference to the mainland of Greece. But what's interesting is after the 18th dynasty, these references fade away. And unless they are mentioned in text copied later, we don't really hear about either of these toponyms, these geographical references at all. But whilst during the 18th dynasty, the relationship was very strong with the Keftiu, and they're found in a range of occupations such as exceptional craftspeople or traders, or even peoples with medical knowledge. And they just seem to come out of nowhere. And we also have to consider that around the 17th century, around the 1700s to 1600 BC mark, it's a truly significant period for Aegean growth, change, and development. Archaeologically, the administrative centers on Neopalatial Crete, the New Palace period, speaking of Knossos, Ketozacros, Sphistos, have an established trade route with the Eastern Mediterranean. And in the Mari letters, we find people of Kaptara, which is thought to be a cognate of Keftiu, supplying Mesopotamian king of Mari, Zimiri Lim, with ornate weapons, clothes, even boats, and their style was so desirable it inspired the palatial wall painting decorations from Al-Alach in the north of Syria, Katna and Tel el-Kabri in Israel. But all of these predate the 18th dynasty and its 18th dynasty reception with Keftiu. What's also apparent in this time frame is the social development in early Mycenaean period, that we best see it in the Mycenaean shaft graves from grave circle B, which we can date roughly to 1800 to 1650, and the later grave circle A, 1700 to 1500 BC, which, especially the later grave circle, was full of exotic materials and objects that we can be quite sure got there as beneficiary links to the lucrative trade network established by Crete. But for all of this, before the 18th dynasty, besides some fine pottery tableware, kamaras ware, and one very significant assemblage of silver vessels, among other exotic items that look to be inspired by Cretan forms, and I'm referring to the El Tod treasures that were buried as in a foundation deposit at the Temple of Monchu, which is 20 kilometers southwest of Karnak, under the reign of Amenemhat II of the Middle Kingdom, there's very little material evidence for direct contact with the Aegean, and no direct mention of Crete, the mainland, or anywhere else in the Aegean. But what's also interesting is that somewhere in between the 17th and the 15th centuries BC, the hotly debated topic is that Thera erupts, and it disrupts the flow of life and connections at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, ushering in the Late Bronze Age, as we call it. And it's only in the 18th dynasty that we start to see some direct contact between Egypt and the Aegean by means of tomb wall paintings showing Innu registers or goods registers with Keftiu emissaries bringing a whole array of lovely objects, either to the court of Pharaoh or to the courtier who is buried in that tomb.
So following the 18th dynasty, which seems, from what you're saying, seems to be a period of much more intense contact than had previously been seen, does that kind of set the tone for the rest of Egyptian-Aegean connection, or does it drop off after that point?
It seems to drop off at that point. Keftiu is definitely mentioned again in the 19th dynasty, in the Ramesside period. And I believe it's in the tomb of Ramesses III. We also have painted stirrup jars that are clearly Aegean in origin. And so there is some reference there to the Aegean world. With respect to the discussions on the sea peoples, it's a bit outside of my area of expertise, and I wouldn't like to comment any further, but I understand that in the academic community, there is discussion about the influence or the cultures involved in this collective that we know as the sea peoples.
How did you become interested in this connection between the Aegean world and the Egyptian world?
So it goes back to my undergraduate days, where I knew I wanted to study something to do with ancient Egypt, and I've always been fascinated by the 18th dynasty and the I've always been fascinated by the 18th dynasty and these great pharaohs and their military accomplishments and grand buildings. But whilst I was studying for my undergraduate, I took a module called Interconnected Worlds, and it opened my eyes to material and this wide picture of a prehistoric society in communication with other cultures thousands of miles apart, it seems, and I've never been able to let it go. It really inspires me.
I think one of the things that I have loved so much about studying the ancient world is maybe the frustrating difficulty as an academic of the fact that nothing will actually stay in the little boxes we try and put it in, and that what is Egyptian, but also possibly Greek, possibly Assyrian, related to the Syro-Palestinian cultures as well. And just everything is like this giant sprawling spider web of interconnections. I think it's beautiful.
Absolutely agree with you. And these ideas of koine and international style, and how, although we're still talking about elite cultures, we're talking about the higher echelons, what they're doing is, stitching themselves together, having this sort of iconographic vocabulary that they all can share, they can all relate to. And I think it's some of the most beautiful that's ever come out of the ancient world.
What then are your plans for the summer, and how will HAPS funding help you?
So this summer, as you know, I'm currently in Greece. I've just finished the spring season at the Palace of Nestor excavation, and I'm due to go back there over the summer. But once that excavation has finished, as a self-funded PhD student, my options are really to either hold out, stay here, do my research here at the British School in Athens for a week or so, or go back into work, which will mean I'm away from my writing, away from my research, at least for a month, maybe two, in order to build up my funds. And my next port of call is to go back to Egypt and go back to the museums and start gathering my data, looking for the material culture, looking for the Aegean influence on certain objects, and being able to formulate some of my theories.
Thank you. And I think if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to talk a little bit about what it means to be a self-funded student in the UK specifically, because a lot of our applicants are from North American universities, which have a very different funding structure. The PhDs are longer, but there is more likely to be funding available to students. And that's simply not the case in the UK, I believe.
It's not the case in the UK. And it's, as somebody who is the first generation to go to university, I didn't have that sort of guidance from parents or family friends on, you know, how to look into university funding or choosing, you know, the right path, or how to look for jobs afterwards. I've really had to do it on my own. And I always knew I wanted to do a PhD. I really wasn't aware of the, you know, the funding opportunities. And so having to do it the way I've had to do it by working and studying at the same time, it's been incredibly difficult. And I suppose it also knocks my confidence. You know, not knowing as much as others do, who I know are very good at getting this funding, who have had the right guidance. Let's say that.
There's kind of like a secret syllabus that no one actually tells you, unless you have those connections already in place.
I really like that. Yeah, I think that's correct. A secret syllabus.
I can't claim that. That's actually a term from Nadira, who is a wonderful classical archaeologist. I'll actually put her information in the description box for anyone who's interested, because she does a lot of fantastic work online. But yes, the secret syllabus is definitely a thing. And actually the reason I ended up coming to the US was because I knew I wanted to do a PhD and knew that I couldn't afford to do it in the UK, because you not only have to pay for your tuition, which is something that I think a lot of people maybe don't understand. As a student, you are still paying the university for the privilege of being a student, but you also have to do things like pay rent or mortgage and buy food and fund yourself when you're going on excavations and research trips.
Absolutely agree. And although it gives you a different, you know, it forces you to learn some very important life skills about money management, it also makes your commitments to study and work and social life very difficult. Trying to keep all three in balance while, you know, trying to pursue something that you desperately want and haven't had the guidance in the past to know where you can go with it. It can be very trying.
It's a difficult thing to navigate, absolutely. I don't have any more questions for you, and we don't have anything coming through from the chat. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover before I let you go?
No, everything's good. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Oh, no, thank you for coming on and joining us. I know it is not easy to fit in online interviews around excavation, but I really appreciate you talking to us about your work.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we are going to say goodbye to Chris. Thank you everyone for watching. It's been a delight and a privilege to hear about all of the research today. If you are new to the channel and you don't know what HAPS is, what we're doing today is interviewing PhD students from across the world who have applied to the nonprofit that I run, which is Humans Against Poor Scholarship. The URL is running across the bottom of your screen, and we provide funding opportunities for PhD students who are engaged in some aspect of research in the ancient Near East. So that can be Egyptology, Hebrew Bible, Assyriology, as you saw with Chris, Aegean and Egyptian interconnectivity. As long as there's something to do with the ancient Near East, students can apply, and they do, and the research is always fascinating and wonderful. We are entirely funded by donations from the general public, people such as yourselves. We don't get things like funding from universities or from any governments. And the interesting and fun thing for me about HAPS is that the donors, everybody who sends us money, gets to vote on the research that they most want to see funded. So if you're watching this and you are a HAPS donor, I will be sending you an email at the end of this month when we finished all of our interviews, asking you to vote for the students that you want to receive the summer scholarship grants. And then we send the money to the students, they go off, they do their research, they come back, and then sometime in the fall or the early winter, they will come back on Digital Hammurabi and tell us about their summer and their research and their future plans. So if you have a couple of dollars, there's no minimum donation. $1 will get you an interview vote. You can just go to hapsfund.com/donate. It's super easy, very, very simple. And we have information up there about our other scholarship fund, which is the Black Scholars Matter program. We send money to Black undergraduate students to go to professional conferences, to make connections and to decide if a career in academia is for them. And I'm very proud of the work we do for both. And it's an awful lot of fun and my privilege to be able to run it and to contribute. So I'm going to end things there. I have to take my 5-year-old to a birthday party. But thank you again for joining us. We will be back tomorrow at noon EDT. Excuse me, we have a couple of Assyriologists coming to talk to us about their research, which is always a joy for me because I'm an Assyriologist and I like talking about Assyriology stuff. Oh, and we do, sorry, one final question. Is the study of the Bronze Age Aegean considered part of ancient Near Eastern studies? By itself, no. I would class that as maybe classical research. Or ancient Mediterranean research, but it's the connection with Egyptology that makes Chris's research eligible for HAPS funding. It's because of that connection to ancient Egypt that he's able to apply. And I love interconnectivity, so I'm just really thrilled to hear about it anyway. But we're going to end here. Join us tomorrow at noon EDT, and every Saturday and Sunday in April, we will be back with more interviews, and then voting will take place in the first week of May. So again, thank you everyone, and have a lovely evening.